In this tutorial, we're going to focus on project scope. That's supposed to be a P. Project scope. Scope can be viewed as two different definitions. The first one is product scope. That's where features and functions characterize what the product service is. This is basically the what. Then you've got the project scope. Project scope is the actual work that needs to be accomplished by the team to deliver a product or service. This is the how. Project scope definition must be monitored and controlled, and I'll put this M and C here for monitor and controlled, continuously until project closure. Ultimately, the goal is to produce the baseline of the scope of work of a project, which is known as the work breakdown structure, or WBS, which I like to show as these boxes. Which knowledge areas in the PMBOK guide are actually impacted? The first one is the project integration knowledge area, and I'll just write that down right here, knowledge area. And there's a process there called Develop Project Management Plan that produces, optionally, a preliminary project scope statement. This leads into another knowledge area that's also identified as the scope knowledge area. And I'll just cross this out and call this scope. In this knowledge area, there is a process called Define Scope. You can see that right there. And this process is the one we're going to be most focused on. Never rely on just verbal scope agreements. Here's an example of an interchange that you may have participated in. Person on the left, the scope wasn't defined. And then of course, the team can respond with, never saw it written down. So that's a problem. And we want to avoid that. We've talked about what scope is. We've talked about the processes that are used with scope definition. So let's spend a moment on which requirements should be in scope for a project. There's the handy hand. As if by magic, this is written on the chalkboard. So it all starts with a target. And this target is a vehicle that is pretty convenient to use that identifies scope that is out of this particular project, in other words, out of scope. And we can show a couple of feature requests in terms of a notepad that are placed out of scope. Now you may wonder why even identify features that are out of scope. Well, it's a good idea, especially if there's been a customer need or an internal priority, to at least identify that they are still important, but not for this specific project. Then you have those features that are possibly in scope, or nice to haves. I tend to use the acronym NTH for that, and these are features that if there is time to get them in, the team will do their best, but it is not required in order to release the project or to close the project. And you may get the feedback from executive management or product management that, oh great, if something's a nice to have, it never gets done. Well, you know what? Prove them wrong. And then you've got the must-haves, those items that are in scope. And I tend to use the acronym MH for in scope. So what you're going to focus in is what customers frequently need or use, and those are must-haves. And there is a 80-20 rule, believe it or not, that 20% of features are mostly used, and the 80% other features are infrequently or never used. So you want to make sure you're choosing what is in scope carefully. So what is used to define this thing called the project scope? Here's the process definition, and we have a couple of inputs over here to the left. We have the project charter that came from the integration knowledge area set of processes when the charter was defined. We also have requirements that was in the prior process called collect requirements. And then we optionally have preliminary project scope statement that I'm not a real fan of, and I see the PMBOK guide is kind of limiting mention of it too. Why bother doing a preliminary project scope statement when you're ultimately going to do the real thing? There's also one other I wanted to show, and this is kind of a treasure chest. This is the environmental factors, the assets, the tried and true background information that you've learned from other projects that you don't usually want to forget that can help in the definition of scope. So what is created? Well, it's the project scope statement. And you know, if I could draw a halo around it, I sure would like to, because this is so important to get it right that it is used throughout all of the processes and all the phases of a project. So that's supposed to be a halo. Alrighty, so what is included in a project scope statement? Here's something from the book called Principles of Software Development Leadership. And here's some of the highlights of what's included in a project scope statement. So, project scope statement. is the project overview, a simple project description, project objectives, basic scope description, boundaries, and these can be things like constraints, also assumptions, all those things that can help or can waylay the success of you defining scope. Also, most importantly, risks. The risks, both positive and negative ones, that may play a factor in scope definition. And we mustn't forget this one. Your team's probably going to hate, but this is the whole schedule estimate. Again, it can be a very rough one as well as cost, and that would typically come from you or management. So those are some of the highlights of what's included in a project scope statement. Great. Now how about pros and cons? Let's talk about the pros first. There's clarity of scope, always important to indicate what the team needs to focus on, and then this will actually result in the team being able to prioritize and to focus on what's most important. That's where you're going to focus on the must-have. How about the cons? Well, there's one you need to keep in mind is triple constraint. That is, any change in the scope may have adverse effect to cost and time, meaning the budget and schedule. You can also have something called scope creep. This is where some additional features get asked along the way, and according to Agile, the typical response is we'd be happy to accommodate that feature. That feature comes in, what goes out? I love that. There could be a risk of making the project scope statement too detailed. And what that would do is it would actually turn into a functional spec, which is something you probably don't want to have happen. What about Agile? Consider documenting just enough information in the project scope definition to do the job and to keep the team focused. Sometimes too much spits in the face of being flexible and agile in order to absorb change that with any project will inevitably take place. Please consider that the scope statement is basically, in the case of Scrum, the product backlog, otherwise known as Scrum Step 1. Ha! So now you know.